For this chapter, open the example project number 11, Real or Virtual MIDI. You may have noticed that there are two types of MIDI tracks in Cubase. One is instrument and the other is MIDI. If you're using a traditional keyboard or synthesizer with sounds built into it and want to use those sounds, you would use a MIDI track. If you want to use a virtual instrument like a software synthesizer, you would use an instrument track. There are a couple differences between these two tracks. MIDI tracks only contain MIDI data and therefore have no sound. So the first thing you'll notice is that a MIDI track doesn't have inserts, equalizers, or sends. These are all audio related and are only found on tracks where audio travels through them. There are a few other differences to point out. An instrument track sends its output to a virtual synthesizer or a soft synth. You can only pick a virtual synth here. On a MIDI track, you can choose its MIDI output. There's a bit of an exception here, however. MIDI tracks came first, before instrument tracks and virtual synths. So all you had were MIDI inputs and outputs. Then programs like Cubase added virtual synths. You had to take many steps to make them work. First, you would call up the VST Instruments panel from the Devices menu. This is also referred to as the VSTI rack. Second, you would choose your virtual synth. Let's choose Cancel for now since I want to show you all the steps here. Let's pick a sound. By the way, if you're unfamiliar with the all-new Halion Sonic SE, don't worry, we're covering it fully in Level 4. And finally, third, you would then create a MIDI track, which I already have, and then assign its output to a virtual synth. That's a lot of steps, and there's one more track eating up space on your mixer. Not very efficient. Plus, the MIDI track really has no control over the EQ and effects for the virtual instrument. You would need to set these in the mixer. Although this method is still a valid way of creating MIDI tracks with virtual synths, there's an easier, more connected way to accomplish this. This is where instrument tracks come in. Instrument tracks have the virtual synth attached to the MIDI track in one great combo pack. This makes it easier to manage your tracks, and now you don't have to remember the extra signal path information. It may not seem like much right now, but imagine having 10 instruments open. That's 10 extra unnecessary channels on your mixer. When you add an instrument track, you get to pick the synth right from the start. You will notice that when you have an instrument track, you don't get things like the bank and program selectors. Nor do you have any MIDI channels. This means that instrument tracks can only have a single stereo output. If you have a multi-timbral virtual synth with 2 or more MIDI channels, meaning it can play 2 or more different sounds at a time, using an instrument track won't allow you to play the other MIDI channels. So now you see why I bothered to show you the, let's say, old-fashioned way of doing it. On the flip side, there are good reasons to use instrument tracks. Instrument tracks allow for much easier handling of VST instruments, because one track corresponds to one channel in the mixer, which corresponds to one VST instrument. The VST instrument is set up automatically with the instrument track, and all automation parameters are available directly in the instrument track. This way, you can move VST instrument automation curves together with the MIDI data. The nice thing about both of these tracks is that you can move the MIDI data back and forth between them. So if you start off with an instrument track and for some reason need to switch to a MIDI track, no problem. In the next chapter, we record with an instrument track, which is basically the same procedure as recording on a MIDI track.